The metal door of the saloon slammed open with such force that everyone inside fell silent, even the piano player whose fingers froze above the yellowed keys. Nora Pruitt stood in the doorway, her chest heaving beneath her faded calico dress, her dark blonde hair escaping the pins that barely held it in place after running through the dusty streets of Fort Lyon, Colorado. The telegram clutched in her trembling hand had arrived 20 minutes ago, and its words had shattered the fragile world she had built since coming west with her father 3 years prior in the summer of 1876. The bartender, a thick-necked man named Samuel Hayes, who smelled perpetually of whiskey and tobacco, looked up from the glass he was polishing with a stained rag. His expression shifted from surprise to something harder, something that made Nora's stomach clench with dread. She had known this moment would come eventually, but she had hoped for more time, prayed for some miracle that would never arrive. "Miss Pruitt," Samuel said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room, "I expected you might show up today." Nora forced herself to walk forward, her worn boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. The men seated at tables throughout the saloon watched her with varying expressions of curiosity, pity, and something else she refused to name. She stopped at the bar, placing both hands flat on its surface to steady herself. "My father is dead," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the grief threatening to overwhelm her. "Cholera took him in Denver 3 days ago. I just received word." Samuel nodded slowly, setting down the glass and rag. "I am sorry for your loss, Miss Pruitt, truly. But that does not change the matter of the debt." The words hit her like a physical blow, though she had expected them. Her father, Thomas Pruitt, had been a good man with a weakness for cards and whiskey. He had borrowed money from the saloon 6 months ago, promising to pay it back within weeks. Those weeks had turned into months, and the debt had grown with interest until it had become an insurmountable mountain of $300. $300, Nora repeated, the number feeling impossible on her tongue. "I work at the general store. I make $12 a month. I have $17 saved." "The debt is due," Samuel said, not unkindly but with the firmness of a man who ran a business. "Your father signed a contract. The saloon owns that debt, and now it falls to you as his only heir." Nora felt the room spinning slightly. $300 might as well have been $3,000. Even if she worked every day for years, she could never accumulate that kind of money, not with the cost of food and rent and the simple necessities of survival in a frontier town. "I need time," she said, hating the desperation in her voice. "Please, give me time to figure something out." Samuel's expression softened slightly, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "How much time would that be, exactly?" Nora turned to see Marcus Webb, the saloon owner, emerging from a back room. He was a man in his late 40s with silver threading through his dark hair and cold eyes that calculated profit and loss with every breath. Unlike Samuel, there was no sympathy in his gaze. "Mr. Webb," Nora said, straightening her spine, "I will pay what my father owed. I just need time to earn it." "At $12 a month?" Webb laughed, a harsh sound that made several men at nearby tables shift uncomfortably. "That would take you over 2 years, and that is not counting interest. I am a businessman, Miss Pruitt, not a charity." "Then what do you suggest?" Nora demanded, anger beginning to replace her fear. "I cannot conjure money from thin air." Webb walked closer, circling her slowly like a predator assessing prey. "There are ways a pretty young woman can earn money quickly in a town like this. The saloon always needs girls to serve drinks, to entertain the customers. You could work off your debt in a few months if you were willing to be accommodating." The implication was clear, and Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and fury. "I am not that kind of woman." "Then you had better find $300 by the end of the week," Webb said coldly. "Or I will have the sheriff seize what little property your father left behind, and you will find yourself with nowhere to live and no prospects at all." The room had gone completely silent again. Nora could feel dozens of eyes on her, watching this humiliation play out like some kind of grotesque theater. She opened her mouth to respond, though she had no idea what she could possibly say, when another voice interrupted from the back of the saloon. "I will pay it." Every head turned toward the speaker. Nora had noticed the man when she first entered, though only peripherally. He sat alone at a corner table, a figure that seemed to take up more space than any normal man should. Now, as he rose to his feet, Nora understood why. He was massive, easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to strain against the worn buckskin shirt he wore. His arms were thick with muscle, visible even through the fabric, and his hands looked like they could break a man in half without much effort. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, slightly unkempt but clean, framing a face that was all hard angles and weathered skin from years in the mountain sun. A thick beard covered his jaw, and his eyes, a startling shade of gray-blue, fixed on Webb with an intensity that made the saloon owner take an involuntary step backward. "Quinn Harlow," Webb said, and Nora heard something new in his voice. Not quite fear, but certainly respect mixed with caution. This is not your concern. Quinn Harlow walked forward with a predator's grace despite his size. He moved past tables and chairs without seeming to notice them, his gaze never leaving Webb's face. When he reached the bar, he pulled a leather pouch from his belt and dropped it on the wooden surface with a heavy thunk that spoke of coins within. $300, Quinn said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate in Nora's chest. Count it if you like, the debt is paid. Webb stared at the pouch, then at Quinn, then back at the pouch. Nora could see the calculations running behind his eyes, the weighing of profit against potential danger. Everyone in Fort Lyon knew of Quinn Harlow. He was a mountain man who came to town perhaps 4 times a year to trade furs and buy supplies. Stories followed him like shadows, tales of his encounters with bears and hostile war parties, of winters survived alone in the high country where other men would have perished. Some said he was half wild himself, more comfortable among wolves than people. This is irregular, Webb said finally. The girl is responsible for her father's debt. Not anymore, Quinn replied. I am paying it. The debt transfers to me. Nora found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. I cannot accept this. I do not even know you. Quinn's gray-blue eyes shifted to her for the first time, and Nora felt the full weight of his attention. It was like standing in front of a winter storm, both terrifying and exhilarating. Up close, she could see the scars that marked his face and hands, evidence of a life lived hard and dangerous. You do not owe me anything, he said, his words directed at her now. Consider it paid. Go live your life. But $300, Nora protested. That is a fortune. Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of Quinn's mouth, though it was hard to tell beneath the beard. I have furs. The trading post paid well this season. It is just money. Webb reached for the pouch, but Quinn's hand shot out, covering it before the saloon owner could touch it. I want the contract, Quinn said. The original one Nora Pruitt signed, and a receipt showing the debt is paid in full. You are being foolish, Harlow, Webb muttered, but he gestured to Samuel. Get the papers. The bartender disappeared into the back room and returned moments later with a folded document and a receipt book. Webb snatched them, scrawled something on the receipt, then pushed both toward Quinn. There. The debt is satisfied. Quinn picked up the contract, glanced at it briefly, then did something that shocked everyone in the room. He tore it in half, then in quarters, and dropped the pieces on the floor. Paid and done, he said. He turned to leave, and Nora found herself moving without thinking, reaching out to grab his arm. Her fingers could not even close halfway around the thick muscle beneath his shirt. Wait, she said. Please, I need to understand why you did this. Quinn looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. For a long moment he did not speak, and Nora thought he might simply pull away and walk out. But then he said, Your father helped me once, 2 years ago, during a bad winter. I came to town half frozen and sick with fever. Most people would not let me through their door. He took me in, gave me a place to sleep in his stable, brought me food and medicine. He asked for nothing in return. Nora felt tears prick her eyes. That sounded like her father, the man who had given his last dollar to help a stranger, even when they had barely enough for themselves. He never mentioned it, she whispered. He would not have, Quinn replied. That was the kind of man he was. I am sorry for your loss. He deserved better than dying alone in Denver. Before Nora could respond, Quinn gently pulled his arm free and walked toward the door. She watched him go, this massive stranger who had just saved her from ruin with no expectation of repayment. The saloon remained silent until he had disappeared into the afternoon sun, and then the conversation slowly resumed, everyone talking about what they had just witnessed. Samuel cleared his throat. You should go home, Miss Pruitt. Get some rest. You have had a difficult day. Nora nodded numbly, picking up the receipt from the bar. The paper felt both weightless and impossibly heavy in her hand. She walked out of the saloon in a daze, barely seeing the dusty street or the people moving past her. Her father was dead. A stranger had paid her debt. The world had turned upside down in less than an hour. She lived in a small room above the general store where she worked. It was not much, just a bed, a chair, a small stove, and a trunk containing everything she owned. But it was hers, and now, thanks to Quinn Harlow, she would not lose it. Nora sat on the bed and let herself cry for the first time since receiving the telegram. She cried for her father, for the dreams they had shared of making a life in Colorado, for the crushing weight of debt that had lifted so unexpectedly. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she lay down and stared at the ceiling as the afternoon light faded into evening. The next morning, Nora woke with a sense of purpose. She dressed carefully in her best dress, though it was still worn and faded, and pinned her hair properly. Then she went downstairs to the general store and asked Mr. Patterson, the owner, if he knew where Quinn Harlow stayed when he was in town. The old boarding house at the end of Main Street, Mr. Patterson said, studying her with curious eyes. Mrs. Donovan keeps a few rooms for trappers and such, but Quinn usually does not stay long. He comes to trade his furs and then heads back to the mountains. Thank you, Nora said, and before she could lose her courage, she walked out of the store and headed down Main Street. Fort Leon in 1879 was not a large town, though it had grown considerably since the Army established its post nearby. Main Street ran straight through the center, lined with wooden buildings that served as shops, saloons, a church, a school, and various other establishments necessary for frontier life. Beyond the town proper, scattered homesteads dotted the landscape, and further still, the mountains rose like jagged teeth against the western sky. The boarding house was a two-story structure that had seen better days. Paint peeled from the siding, and the porch creaked ominously as Nora climbed the steps. She knocked on the door, and a moment later, it opened to reveal a plump woman in her 60s with kind eyes and flour dusting her apron. "Mrs. Donovan?" Nora asked. "That is me, dear. What can I do for you? I am looking for Quinn Harlow. Is he staying here?" Mrs. Donovan's expression shifted to something knowing and a little amused. "You are the Pruitt girl, are you not? Heard what happened at the saloon yesterday. Whole town is talking about it." Nora felt her cheeks warm. "I need to speak with him. He is out back tending to his horse. Go around the side of the house. You will find him." Nora thanked her and followed the narrow path along the building's side to a small yard behind the boarding house. There she found Quinn Harlow brushing down a large roan stallion with steady, practiced strokes. The horse was as impressive as its owner, all muscle and power, its coat gleaming in the morning sun. Quinn looked up as she approached, and Nora saw surprise flicker across his face before it settled back into neutral calm. "Miss Pruitt," he said, continuing his work. "Did not expect to see you again." "I came to thank you properly," Nora said, standing a respectful distance away. The horse eyed her with what she interpreted as mild interest. "And to ask why you really did it. I told you why. Your father helped me. $300 is more than a stable and some food," Nora pressed. "There has to be more to it." Quinn set down the brush and turned to face her fully. In the daylight she could see him even more clearly. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his early 30s, though the weathering of his face made it hard to tell. The scars she had noticed before told stories of violence survived, but his hands, though calloused and rough, moved with surprising gentleness as they had stroked the horse's coat. "Your father did more than give me shelter," Quinn said after a long moment. "He talked to me like I was a person, not some wild thing to be feared or avoided. He asked about my life in the mountains, about what I had seen and done. He shared his own stories, told me about you, about coming west after your mother died. He made me feel human again." The words were simple, but Nora heard the depth of meaning beneath them. She understood, perhaps for the first time, how isolated Quinn's life must be, how lonely the long winters in the high country with no company but his own thoughts. "He would have been honored to know he made such an impression," Nora said softly. "He always saw the best in people. He raised a good daughter," Quinn replied. "You stood up to Webb yesterday. That took courage." "I was terrified," Nora admitted. "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing what needs to be done despite it." They stood in silence for a moment, and Nora found herself studying him, trying to understand this man who had crashed into her life like a force of nature. He was so different from anyone she had ever known, so completely outside her experience of the world. "When do you leave?" she asked finally. "Tomorrow morning. I have supplies to buy today, and then I head back to my cabin." "Where is your cabin?" Quinn gestured vaguely toward the mountains. 3 days' ride northwest. High country near the tree line. It is isolated, but that is how I prefer it." "That sounds lonely," Nora said before she could stop herself. Something flickered in Quinn's eyes, but he just shrugged. "It is the life I chose." "Why?" The question escaped before Nora could consider whether it was too personal, too intrusive. But she genuinely wanted to know what would drive a man to such isolation. Quinn was quiet for so long that Nora thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I was a different person once. Lived in a town, worked a regular job, had plans for the future. But the war came and I enlisted. Fought for 4 years in battles that changed me in ways I did not understand until it was over. When I came back, I could not fit into that old life anymore. The noise, the crowds, the constant chatter of people who had no idea what I had seen, what I had done. It felt suffocating. So I left, went to the mountains, and found peace in the silence." Nora absorbed this information, understanding clicking into place. Her father had mentioned the war sometimes, though he had not fought himself, being too old when it started. But she knew it had scarred a generation of men, left them struggling to find their place in a world that had kept turning while they were gone. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "And thank you again for what you did. I wish there was some way I could repay you." "You owe me nothing," Quinn repeated firmly. "Live a good life, Miss Pruitt. That is repayment enough." He picked up the brush and returned his attention to the horse, a clear dismissal. Nora knew she should leave, should accept his generosity and move on with her life. But something kept her rooted to the spot, some feeling she could not quite name that made her reluctant to walk away from this strange, scarred mountain man who had saved her without expecting anything in return. "Would you let me buy you dinner?" she asked suddenly. "It is the least I can do." Quinn's hands stilled on the horse's flank. "That is not necessary." "I know it is not necessary," Nora said, surprised by her own boldness. "But I would like to. Please, let me do this one small thing." He turned to look at her again, and Nora met his gaze steadily. She saw him considering, weighing something internal that she could not perceive. Finally, he nodded once. "All right. Where? The restaurant by the church. 6 o'clock? I will be there." Nora smiled, feeling an unexpected lightness in her chest. "Thank you. I will see you then." She left before he could change his mind, walking back through the town with a strange energy buzzing through her veins. She was being foolish, she told herself. Quinn Harlow was leaving tomorrow, returning to his isolated existence in the mountains. This dinner would be a brief moment, nothing more. But somehow that did not diminish her anticipation. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Nora worked at the general store, helping customers and organizing inventory, but her mind kept drifting to the evening ahead. She had not felt this kind of nervous excitement since before her father's health had started failing, before the weight of his debt had settled on her shoulders. It felt almost foreign, this flutter of possibility. At 5:30 she rushed upstairs to her room and changed into her nicest dress, a deep green that brought out the color in her eyes. She brushed her hair until it shone, then pinned it up in a style that was both practical and pretty. Looking at herself in the small mirror above her washstand, she barely recognized the young woman staring back. When had she last taken care with her appearance, last felt anything other than exhausted resignation? The restaurant was a modest establishment run by a German couple who served hearty food at reasonable prices. When Nora arrived just before 6, she found Quinn already waiting outside. He had clearly made an effort as well, wearing a clean shirt and having tamed his long hair somewhat, though it still fell past his shoulders. Without the dusty trail clothes, he looked almost civilized, though there was no hiding the raw power in his frame or the wildness that seemed to emanate from him like heat from a fire. "You are early," Nora said, pleased. Mountain habit. Better to be waiting than to be waited for. They went inside and found a table in the corner. The restaurant was moderately busy, and Nora noticed several people glancing their way with poorly concealed interest. News traveled fast in a town like Fort Lyon, and the story of Quinn paying her father's debt had clearly made the rounds. They ordered food, stew, and fresh bread with butter, and for a few minutes they ate in comfortable silence. Nora found herself studying Quinn when she thought he was not looking, taking in the details she had missed before. The way he held his fork suggested he had not always been a mountain man, that somewhere in his past he had learned proper table manners. The scars on his hands were old, some faded to white lines, others more recent and still pink. "You are staring," Quinn said without looking up from his plate. Nora felt her cheeks heat. "I apologize. I did not mean to be rude. It is all right. I am used to it. I know I look like something that crawled out of the wilderness." "That is not what I was thinking," Nora protested. "I was thinking that you look like someone with a lot of stories to tell." Quinn did look up then, and something that might have been amusement glinted in his gray-blue eyes. "Most of my stories involve sitting in a cabin waiting for winter to end or tracking game through the snow." "Not very exciting. Tell me one anyway," Nora urged. "A mountain story." Quinn considered this while chewing a piece of bread. Then he said, "Last winter, about February, when the snow was so deep I could barely open my cabin door, a mountain lion decided to make a den under my woodpile. I discovered this when I went out for firewood and heard growling. Turned out she had cubs, 3 of them, tiny little things that could not have been more than a few weeks old." "What did you do?" Nora asked, leaning forward with interest. "I left her alone, built a shelter over that side of the woodpile to keep the worst of the snow off, and I cut my firewood from trees further away. Checked on her every few days to make sure she and the cubs were all right. By April she had moved on, taking her babies with her to hunt." "You protected them," Nora said softly. "Even though a mountain lion is dangerous, she was just a mother trying to keep her young alive," Quinn replied. "I understood that. Besides, the mountains are her home more than mine. I am just a visitor there, even if I have been visiting for a long time." Nora found herself smiling. "That is beautiful. The way you see it, I mean." Quinn looked uncomfortable, shifting in his chair. "It is just practical. The land will be there long after I am gone. Seems foolish to fight against it when you can learn to live with it." They continued talking through the meal, and Nora found herself drawn deeper into conversation. Quinn was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, his words carried weight and meaning. He asked her about her work at the general store, about her life before coming west, and he listened with genuine attention when she answered. Nora told him about growing up in Ohio, about her mother dying when she was 15, about her father's decision to seek new opportunities in Colorado. She spoke of the journey west, the mixture of fear and excitement, the harsh reality of frontier life that was so different from anything she had imagined. She talked about her father's kindness, his weakness for gambling, the way his debts had slowly accumulated until they became insurmountable. He tried, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He really did try to make a good life for us. But things kept going wrong, and he would turn to cards, thinking he could win enough to solve all our problems. Of course, it never worked that way. Grief makes people do strange things, Quinn said. He lost your mother. That kind of pain does not just disappear because you move to a new place. You sound like you understand that. I do. Quinn was quiet for a moment, then added, I was married once, before the war. She was pregnant when I left to enlist. I thought I would be back in a few months, that the fighting would end quickly. Instead, I was gone for 4 years. She died giving birth while I was away, and the baby, a daughter, only lived 3 days. Nora felt her heart clench with sympathy. Quinn, I am so sorry. He shook his head. It was a long time ago, 14 years now. But it changed me, knowing I was not there when she needed me most. When I finally came home, I visited her grave, and I realized I did not belong in that town anymore. Everything reminded me of what I had lost, what I could never get back. So I left and never looked back. Is that why you stay in the mountains alone? Partly. But also because I found something there I had not expected. Peace, purpose. A life that made sense on its own terms without needing to fit into anyone else's expectations. Nora reached across the table and placed her hand on his, a gesture of comfort and understanding. Quinn looked down at her small hand covering his scarred, work-roughened one, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then he turned his hand over, gently squeezing her fingers before releasing them. Thank you for dinner, he said quietly, and for the company. It has been a long time since I talked this much. Thank you for sharing your stories, Nora replied. And for yesterday, for everything. They left the restaurant together, stepping out into the cool evening air. The sun had set while they were eating, and now stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Fort Leon settled into its nighttime rhythm, the sounds of the saloons rising in the distance, families behind closed doors settling down for sleep. Quinn walked Nora back to the general store, his presence beside her making her feel safe in a way she had not experienced since her father's health began to fail. When they reached her door, she turned to face him, reluctant for the evening to end. You leave tomorrow? She asked, though she already knew the answer. At first light. I have a long ride ahead. Will you come back to town eventually? Probably not until late fall when I trade my next season's furs. Nora tried to hide her disappointment. That is months away. It is, Quinn agreed. He studied her face in the dim light spilling from nearby windows. Why does that matter to you? It was a direct question that demanded an honest answer. Nora took a breath, gathering her courage. Because I would like to see you again. To talk more. I realize that probably sounds foolish given we barely know each other, but I feel like I could be friends with you. Like maybe we already are friends in some strange way. Quinn was quiet for a long moment, and Nora felt her heart sink, certain she had overstepped, revealed too much too soon. But then he said, I feel that too. It surprised me. I am not used to wanting company, so you will come back? I will come back, he promised. Maybe sooner than fall if I can manage it. But my life in the mountains, it is not something I can just walk away from for long. I have responsibilities there, traps to check, a cabin to maintain, hunting to do. It is how I survive. I understand, Nora said. And she did, even though part of her wanted to ask him to stay, to give up his isolated existence and remain in Fort Leon. But that would be selfish and unfair. Quinn had found his place in the world, and she had no right to ask him to abandon it. Good night, Nora, Quinn said, using her first name for the first time. The sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool air. Good night, Quinn. She watched him walk away, his broad shoulders disappearing into the darkness, and felt an ache in her chest that she did not quite understand. They had spent one evening together. That should not be enough to create this sense of loss at his departure. Yet here she was, already counting the months until he might return. The next morning, Nora woke early, driven by an impulse she did not fully examine. She dressed quickly and made her way to the boarding house, hoping to catch Quinn before he left. She found him in the yard, loading supplies onto his horse with efficient, practiced movements. The stallion was already saddled, and it was clear he would be leaving within minutes. I wanted to say goodbye properly, Nora said, slightly breathless from her hurried walk. Quinn turned, and something softened in his expression when he saw her. I am glad you came. I brought you something. Nora pulled a small package wrapped in brown paper from her pocket. It is not much, just some food for your journey. Bread and cheese and dried meat. I made the bread myself last night. Quinn took the package with surprising gentleness, his large hands careful not to crush it. You did not have to do this. I wanted to. Call it a thank you that I can actually give. He tucked the package into his saddlebag, then stood there looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. Finally, he said, I meant what I said last night. I will come back. Sooner if I can. I will be here, Nora replied. Working at the general store, living above it, same as always. Quinn nodded, then surprised her by reaching out and gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so intimate, so unexpected, that Nora felt her breath catch. His fingers lingered for just a moment against her cheek, warm and rough and impossibly tender. Take care of yourself, Nora Pruitt, he said quietly. You too, Quinn Harlow. He mounted his horse with easy grace despite his size, settling into the saddle like he was born there. With a final nod, he turned the stallion toward the western road and rode away. Nora stood watching until he disappeared from view, and even then she remained a few minutes longer, staring at the empty road and trying to understand the confusing tangle of emotions in her chest. The weeks that followed settled into a routine. Nora worked at the general store, served customers, organized inventory, and lived her quiet life. But everything felt different now. She found herself thinking of Quinn at odd moments, remembering things he had said, wondering what he was doing in his mountain cabin. Did he think of her too? Or had she been just a brief interlude, already forgotten in the demands of his isolated existence? Fort Lyon continued its daily rhythm around her. The army post brought soldiers who needed supplies. Settlers passing through on their way to homesteads further west stopped to stock up on provisions. The saloons did steady business, and the church held services every Sunday that Nora attended faithfully. She made friends with some of the other young women in town, though most were married with children or engaged to soldiers from the fort. They were kind to her, including her in their occasional gatherings, but Nora always felt slightly apart, as if she existed in a different sphere from their domestic concerns and hopes. Summer deepened, bringing heat that baked the Colorado plains and made work in the general store feel like laboring in an oven. Nora served customers, counted money, swept floors, and tried not to think about how empty her life felt. She had been saved from debt, had her room and her job, had enough to eat and a safe place to sleep. By any practical measure, she should be content. Yet she felt hollow, as if something essential was missing. 2 months after Quinn left, a fur trapper came through town, a grizzled man named Pete who occasionally traded at the general store. Nora worked up the courage to ask him if he knew Quinn Harlow. Pete's weathered face broke into a grin. Know him? Hell, everyone in the high country knows Quinn Harlow. Best trapper in the territory, and tough as they come. Why you asking? I met him when he was in town this spring, Nora said, trying to sound casual. I wondered how he was doing. Quinn keeps to himself mostly, but I saw him about 3 weeks ago at a trading post up in the mountains. He was doing fine, had a good load of summer pelts. Mentioned he might come down to Fort Lyon before the first snow instead of waiting until fall. Said he had business here. Nora's heart leaped at this information, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. That is good to know, thank you. Pete studied her with knowing eyes. You sweet on Quinn? I barely know him, Nora protested, feeling her cheeks warm. That is not what I asked. Pete chuckled. Quinn is a good man, despite what some folks say about him being half wild. If he has taken an interest in you, you could do a lot worse. He has not taken an interest in me, Nora said firmly. He simply did me a kindness, and I am grateful. If you say so, miss. But Pete's grin suggested he did not believe her protestations for a moment. After Pete left, Nora found herself unable to concentrate on work. The possibility that Quinn might return before fall made her stomach flutter with nervous anticipation. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that she was reading too much into a single evening of conversation. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger as the days passed. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon in late August, Nora was helping a customer select fabric when the door to the general store opened. She glanced up automatically, ready to greet whoever had entered, and froze. Quinn Harlow stood in the doorway, looking even larger than she remembered in the confines of the store. He wore clean buckskins and his hair was tied back, though it had grown even longer. His gray-blue eyes scanned the space until they found her, and then something in his expression softened. Quinn, Nora breathed, barely aware that she had spoken aloud. The customer she had been helping, Mrs. Henderson, turned to look at Quinn and made a small sound of surprise. Most people reacted that way to Quinn's presence, Nora had noticed. He was simply too big, too intense, too different from normal townspeople to blend into the background. Excuse me, Mrs. Henderson, Nora said, struggling to maintain her professional composure. I need to speak with this gentleman for a moment. She walked toward Quinn on legs that felt strangely unsteady. Up close she could see that he looked thinner than before, his face more weathered, but his eyes held the same quiet strength she remembered. You came back, she said unnecessarily. I said I would. A slight smile tugged at his mouth beneath the beard. I finished my summer trapping early and decided I would rather be here than alone in my cabin. The words sent warmth flooding through Nora's chest. How long are you staying? A few days. Maybe a week. I need to trade some furs and buy supplies. And I thought if you were willing we could spend some time together. get to know each other better. I would like that, Nora said, unable to keep the happiness from her voice. I would like that very much. Good. Quinn glanced around the store, clearly uncomfortable with the attention they were drawing. Mrs. Henderson was watching them with undisguised curiosity, and Mr. Patterson had emerged from the back room to see what was happening. When do you finish work today? 6 o'clock. I will come back then. Maybe we could take a walk? Yes, that sounds perfect. Quinn nodded, gave her one more long look that made her feel like the only person in the world, then turned and left. The moment the door closed behind him, Mrs. Henderson rushed over. Was that Quinn Harlow? She demanded. The mountain man? Yes, Nora admitted. And he came here specifically to see you? It appears so. Mrs. Henderson's eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and excitement. My goodness, the whole town is going to be talking about this. She was right, of course. By the time 6 o'clock arrived, Nora had heard from 3 more customers who had somehow learned that Quinn Harlow had returned to Fort Lyon and had been seen entering the general store to speak with Nora Pruitt. The gossip mill in a small town was remarkably efficient. Nora tried not to think about what people were saying as she finished her work and went upstairs to change into a fresh dress. She brushed her hair and pinned it up, applied a tiny bit of color to her cheeks and lips, then stood back to examine herself in the mirror. She looked nervous and excited and hopeful, all emotions clearly written on her face. When she came back downstairs, Quinn was waiting outside. He had changed clothes as well, wearing dark trousers and a clean shirt that looked new. The effort he had made pleased her more than it probably should have. They walked through town together, and Nora was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Quinn seemed oblivious. His attention focused entirely on her as they headed toward the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open land. Tell me about your summer, Nora said as they walked. What was it like in the mountains? Quinn considered the question, his long strides automatically adjusting to match her shorter ones. Busy. Summer is when you prepare for winter. I spent most of my time hunting and preserving meat, gathering and drying herbs, repairing my cabin, setting traps for the pelts I traded today. But it was also beautiful. The high meadows were full of wildflowers, and the streams ran clear and cold from snowmelt. It sounds peaceful. It is, but also lonely. He glanced at her. More lonely than usual this summer. I kept thinking about our dinner, about the conversations we had. About you. Nora's breath caught. I thought about you too, constantly. I told myself I was being foolish, that one evening together did not mean anything, but I could not seem to help it. I told myself the same thing, Quinn admitted. That I had no business thinking about a woman when my life is what it is. But then I would be sitting by my fire at night, and I would wonder what you were doing, whether you were safe and happy. And I realized I wanted to know the answers to those questions. I wanted to see you again. They had reached the outskirts of town now, where a small creek ran through a grove of cottonwood trees. The sound of water over rocks was soothing, and the shade provided relief from the August heat. Without discussing it, they both sat down on the creek bank, close enough that Nora could feel the warmth radiating from Quinn's large frame. What are we doing? Nora asked softly. What is happening between us? Quinn was quiet for a moment, staring at the water. Then he said, I do not know what to call it, but I know I have not felt this way about anyone since my wife died. I know I rode 3 days to get here because I could not stand being away from you any longer, and I know that scares me more than anything I have faced in the mountains. Nora turned to look at him, seeing the vulnerability beneath his rough exterior. It scares me too. You live in the wilderness, and I live in town. Your life and mine are completely different. I do not see how this could work. Neither do I, Quinn said. But I also do not want to walk away without trying. Trying what exactly? He turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his gray-blue eyes made Nora's heart race. Courting you. Seeing if this feeling between us is real or just some strange moment that will pass. I know it will not be easy. I know there are obstacles, but I would like to try. Nora felt tears prick her eyes, though she was not sad. The opposite, in fact. I would like that too. More than I can say. Quinn reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. They sat like that for a long time, watching the creek flow past and simply being together. No more words were necessary. They had acknowledged what was growing between them, had agreed to explore it despite the difficulties. That was enough for now. Over the next week, Quinn and Nora spent every moment they could together. He would come to the general store during her lunch break, and they would eat together on the bench outside. In the evenings, they would walk through town or sit by the creek, talking about everything and nothing. Quinn told her more stories of his life in the mountains, and Nora shared memories of her childhood in Ohio, her dreams for the future, her fears and hopes. They learned each other slowly, carefully, building something fragile and precious between them. Nora discovered that beneath Quinn's rough exterior was a man of surprising gentleness and deep intelligence. He read books when he could get them, studying everything from natural history to poetry. He had strong opinions about the treatment of native tribes, having lived peacefully alongside them in the high country and witnessed the injustices inflicted by the government. He spoke of the land with a reverence that bordered on spiritual. Quinn, in turn, discovered Nora's quiet strength, her determination to build a good life despite the hardships she had faced. He learned about her kindness, evident in how she treated every customer at the general store with patience and respect. He saw her sharp intelligence in the way she calculated accounts and managed inventory, skills that were being wasted on such simple work. On Quinn's last evening in Fort Lyon, they walked further from town than they ever had before, following the creek until they reached a place where rock formations created natural seats overlooking the water. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the air had cooled to a comfortable temperature. "I leave tomorrow," Quinn said, the words heavy between them. "I know." Nora had been trying not to think about it, but the reality could no longer be avoided. "I will come back in a month," he continued. "I need to finish preparing for winter, but after that I can make another trip." "A month is not so long," Nora said. Though her heart disagreed, Quinn turned to her, and in the fading light, his expression was both tender and determined. "Nora, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "All right. Could you see yourself living in the mountains?" "I do not mean right away, and I am not asking you to commit to anything now. But in theory, if things between us continue to develop, is that a life you could imagine?" Nora considered the question carefully. She thought about the isolation Quinn had described, the harsh winters, the dangerous wildlife, the distance from other people. It was so far from anything she had ever experienced. But she also thought about Quinn himself, about the peace he had found in that life, about the possibility of building something together away from the prying eyes and constant gossip of town life. "I do not know," she said finally, choosing honesty. "I have never experienced anything like that, but I think with you I could be happy anywhere. Does that make sense?" "It does." Quinn reached up and cupped her face with one large hand, his thumb stroking her cheekbone with infinite care. "I am falling in love with you, Nora Pruitt. I did not think I would ever feel this way again. But here we are." Nora felt tears slip down her cheeks, though she was smiling. "I am falling in love with you too. It is terrifying and wonderful at the same time." "May I kiss you?" Quinn asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Nora breathed. "Please." He leaned down, and Nora rose up to meet him. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle at first, almost hesitant, as if they were both afraid of breaking something precious. But then Quinn's arms came around her, pulling her close, and Nora's hands fisted in his shirt, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing and promise, and the beginning of something that could not be easily undone. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. "I will come back," he said fiercely. "No matter what. 1 month, and I will be here. I will be waiting," Nora promised. They sat together until full darkness fell, holding each other and stealing kisses and making plans for his return. When Quinn finally walked her back to the general store, Nora felt both achingly sad and impossibly happy. Saying goodbye was painful, but knowing he would return made it bearable. The next morning she woke early again to see him off. This time their farewell was more lingering, Quinn holding her close and pressing kisses to her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. When he finally rode away, Nora stood watching until he was completely out of sight, then wiped her tears and went to work. The month that followed was the longest of Nora's life. She counted days, then hours as Quinn's promised return grew closer. She worked, attended church, participated in the occasional social gathering, but all of it felt hollow compared to the anticipation of seeing Quinn again. True to his word, Quinn returned exactly 1 month later. This time, he stayed for 2 weeks, and their relationship deepened further. They talked about the future more seriously now, discussing the practical realities of how they might make a life together. Quinn offered to build an addition onto his cabin to make it more comfortable for 2 people. Nora admitted her fears about being so isolated, but also her growing conviction that a life with Quinn, wherever that might be, was worth any sacrifice. People in Fort Lyon had noticed their relationship now, and opinions were divided. Some thought Nora was foolish to fall for a mountain man, that she would end up alone and miserable in the wilderness. Others admired her courage, saw the way Quinn looked at her, and believed in their connection. The gossip was constant, but Nora found she cared less and less what others thought. On the last night of Quinn's visit, they were sitting by their favorite spot at the creek when he pulled something from his pocket. It was a small wooden box, crudely made but carefully crafted. "I made this for you," Quinn said, handing it to her. "Open it." Inside the box, nestled on a piece of soft leather, was a ring. It was made of silver, clearly handcrafted, with a small turquoise stone set in a simple band. The workmanship was rough but beautiful in its sincerity. "Quinn," Nora whispered, her hands trembling. "I am not good with words," he said, his own voice unsteady. And this is not a fancy ring from a jeweler, but I made it myself and I want you to have it. I want you to be my wife, Nora. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, whether that is in the mountains or somewhere else entirely. Will you marry me?" Nora looked from the ring to Quinn's face, seeing hope and fear and love in his expression. She thought about her life before meeting him, the grinding loneliness, the weight of debt and obligation. She thought about the man he had proven himself to be, kind and strong and honest in ways that were increasingly rare. She thought about the future they could build together, different from anything she had imagined but potentially more fulfilling than any conventional life. "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you." Quinn's whole face transformed, a smile breaking across his features that made him look years younger. He took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the turquoise catching the last rays of sunlight. Then he was kissing her again, and Nora was kissing him back, and they were both laughing and crying at the same time. When they finally separated, Quinn held her close, his arms wrapped around her as if he would never let go. "How do you want to do this?" he asked. "I can stay in town while you prepare, or you can come to the mountains with me now and we can have the minister from Fort Lyon come up to marry us there." Nora considered. "I think I would like to be married here, with the few friends I have made. But soon. I do not want to wait months." 2 weeks, Quinn suggested. "That will give me time to go back to my cabin and prepare it properly for you, gather my best furs to trade for supplies, and then come back. We can marry and leave together." 2 weeks, Nora agreed. "That is perfect." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Nora gave her notice at the general store, explaining to a shocked Mr. Patterson that she was getting married and moving to the mountains. She purchased fabric and sewed herself a simple but beautiful wedding dress in cream-colored cotton. She packed her belongings, selling or giving away anything she could not reasonably take to Quinn's remote cabin. The women of Fort Lyon, whatever their opinions of her choice, rallied to help her prepare. Mrs. Henderson and the others helped with the dress, organized a simple wedding breakfast, and offered advice on what supplies she would need for mountain living. Some of it was helpful, some less so, but Nora appreciated the effort. Quinn returned as promised, and they were married on a Sunday morning in the small church at Fort Lyon. Nora wore her cream dress with wildflowers in her hair, and Quinn wore new clothes he had purchased specially for the occasion, his hair braided back and his beard neatly trimmed. He looked almost civilized, except for the raw power in his frame and the wildness that still lurked in his eyes. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. They spoke their vows before the minister and the small crowd of townspeople who had gathered, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of their lives. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Quinn kissed Nora with such tender passion that several women in the congregation sighed audibly. The wedding breakfast was held at the restaurant where they had shared their first dinner, and it was a lively affair despite the modest size. People toasted their happiness, wished them well, and offered various pieces of advice about married life. Nora looked around at the faces of people who had become familiar over the past few years and felt a pang of sadness at leaving. But then she looked at Quinn, at her husband, and the sadness was overwhelmed by excitement for the future. They left Fort Lyon that afternoon, Quinn helping Nora onto a gentle mare he had purchased for her, while their supplies were loaded onto a pack horse. As they rode away from town, Nora turned back once to look at the place that had been her home. Then she faced forward, toward the mountains and whatever lay ahead. The 3-day journey to Quinn's cabin was unlike anything Nora had experienced. They traveled through terrain that grew progressively wilder and more beautiful, following trails that only Quinn seemed able to see. At night they camped under the stars, and Quinn taught Nora how to build a proper fire, how to cook over open flames, how to read the sounds of the forest around them. He was patient with her inexperience, never making her feel foolish for not knowing things that were second nature to him. And at night, in the privacy of their bedroll, they explored their new intimacy as husband and wife with a combination of passion and tenderness that left Nora breathless and amazed. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they rounded a bend in the trail, and Quinn said, "There, that is home." Nora looked where he pointed and saw a sturdy log cabin nestled in a small clearing. It was larger than she had expected, with a covered porch and a stone chimney rising from one end. Behind it, mountains rose like sentinels, their peaks still touched with snow even in late September. A creek ran nearby, its sound audible even from a distance, and evergreen forests surrounded the clearing on all sides. It was isolated, remote, and absolutely beautiful. As they approached, Nora saw that Quinn had been busy during his last visit. The cabin looked freshly chinked, the porch was swept clean, and firewood was stacked neatly under an overhang. He had clearly worked hard to make it ready for her arrival. Quinn helped her down from the mare and took her hand, leading her to the cabin door. "It is not much," he said, suddenly sounding uncertain. But it is solid and warm, and I have done what I could to make it comfortable. Show me, Nora said, squeezing his hand. He opened the door and Nora stepped inside. The cabin was a single large room with a sleeping area at one end, a cooking area with a proper stove at the other, and a living space in the middle. The addition Quinn had mentioned was clearly in progress, with framing visible for what would become a second room. Furs covered the bed, and curtains Quinn had clearly purchased in town hung at the windows. A rocking chair sat near the fireplace, and shelves lined the walls, holding books, supplies, and various items Quinn had collected over the years. It was rustic and simple, but it was also clean and well organized, and Nora could see the care Quinn had taken to make it welcoming. "It is wonderful," she said honestly. "It is going to be a good home." The relief on Quinn's face was palpable. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "Our home," he corrected. "Everything I have is yours now, Nora. I want you to be happy here." "I will be," she promised. "As long as we are together, I will be happy." The first weeks of their marriage were a period of adjustment. Nora had to learn the rhythms of mountain life, the daily tasks that kept them fed and warm. Quinn taught her how to hunt and fish, how to preserve meat and forage for edible plants, how to read weather signs and anticipate storms. He showed her his trap lines and explained how he managed them to ensure sustainable harvests. He introduced her to the patterns of wildlife around the cabin, teaching her which animals were dangerous and which were merely curious. Nora, in turn, brought her own skills to their partnership. She organized the cabin more efficiently, created better storage systems, and improved their cooking with recipes and techniques Quinn had never learned. She sewed curtains and cushions that made the space more comfortable. She started a small herb garden near the cabin, planning for plants that would provide medicine and flavoring for their food. They worked together to finish the addition to the cabin, creating a separate bedroom and a small sitting room that gave them more space. Quinn did the heavy construction while Nora assisted and offered suggestions, and together they created something better than either could have managed alone. But more than the practical adjustments, they learned each other in the intimate ways of married life. Quinn discovered that Nora sang while she worked, old songs from her childhood that filled the cabin with music. Nora learned that Quinn had nightmares sometimes, remnants of his war experiences, and she learned how to soothe him back to sleep with gentle touches and whispered reassurances. They made love by firelight and candlelight, learning each other's bodies with patient exploration. Quinn was always careful with her, conscious of his size and strength, but Nora encouraged his passion, finding joy in his desire for her. They talked late into the night about everything and nothing, building the foundation of partnership that would sustain them through the years ahead. Winter came early to the high country that year. By late October, snow was falling regularly, and Quinn began preparing in earnest for the long months of isolation ahead. He hunted extensively, bringing down an elk that would provide much of their winter meat. He checked and reinforced their firewood supply, making sure they had enough to last until spring. He weatherproofed the cabin, sealing every crack and gap against the bitter cold to come. Nora helped with all of it, learning quickly and adapting to the demands of their life. She was tired most nights, her muscles aching from unaccustomed labor, but she was also deeply satisfied. This life had purpose and meaning in ways her previous existence had lacked. Every task they completed together made them more secure, more capable of weathering whatever the mountains might throw at them. The first major storm hit in early November, a blizzard that lasted 3 days and left snow piled higher than Nora had ever seen. She and Quinn stayed inside, keeping the fire burning and passing the time with conversation, reading, and the quiet intimacy of simply being together. Nora realized she was not lonely despite the isolation. How could she be when Quinn was there, his presence filling the cabin with warmth and safety? As winter deepened and the snow continued to fall, Nora discovered something else. She was pregnant. The signs had been building for weeks, but she had been too busy adapting to her new life to pay close attention. Now, as she sat by the fire one evening while Quinn repaired a snowshoe, she placed a hand on her still flat stomach and felt a surge of emotion so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. "Quinn," she said softly. He looked up immediately, always attuned to her voice. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong." Nora smiled through her tears. "Everything is right. I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." Quinn froze, the snowshoe forgotten in his hands. For a moment he did not move, did not speak, and Nora felt a flutter of worry. Then he set aside his work and crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair and placing his large hands gently on her stomach. "A baby," he repeated, his voice rough with emotion. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor. But yes, I am certain." Quinn looked up at her, and Nora saw tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "I never thought I would have this chance again. After losing my first wife and child, I believed that door was closed forever." Nora cupped his face in her hands, wiping away his tears with her thumbs. "We have been given a second chance, both of us. We get to build the family we both lost." Quinn pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of glass, as if she might break if he squeezed too hard. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other and the knowledge of the new life growing between them. The rest of that winter was both the longest and shortest period of Nora's life. The pregnancy was relatively easy, though morning sickness made the first months challenging. Quinn was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worrying about her health and trying to prevent her from doing anything he deemed too strenuous. Nora had to repeatedly remind him that pregnancy was not an illness, that she was still capable of contributing to their daily work. They spent long hours talking about the future, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about how they would manage with a baby in such an isolated location. Quinn admitted his fears about something going wrong during the birth, about losing Nora the way he had lost his first wife. Nora shared her own fears, but also her faith that everything would be all right, that they would face whatever came together. As spring approached and the snow began to melt, Quinn made a decision. "I want you to go to Fort Lyon for the birth," he said. "I want you to have a doctor and other women around in case there are complications." Nora had been expecting this. "What about you? I will come with you. We will go to town a month before the baby is due, stay at the boarding house, and remain until you and the baby are strong enough to travel back. I do not care what it costs or how uncomfortable I am in town. Your safety is more important than anything else." Nora felt a wave of love for this man who was willing to endure the thing he found most difficult, being around people and living in town for her sake. "All right, we will do it your way." In late May, when Nora was about 8 months pregnant, they made the journey back to Fort Lyon. It was slow going, Quinn insisting they stop frequently to rest, but they made it safely. Mrs. Donovan welcomed them back to the boarding house with genuine warmth, and Dr. Harrison, the town physician, examined Nora and pronounced both her and the baby healthy. The month they spent waiting was strange for both of them. Fort Lyon felt foreign after the isolation of the mountains, too loud and crowded and full of bustle. But there were also unexpected pleasures. Nora reconnected with friends she had made before leaving, and they threw her a small party to celebrate the coming baby, giving her handmade gifts and advice. Quinn, though clearly uncomfortable, endured the social interactions with patience, always staying close to Nora's side. The baby, a girl with Quinn's gray-blue eyes and Nora's blonde hair, was born on a warm June evening in 1880. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Quinn's fears seemed justified. But Dr. Harrison was skilled, and with his help and the support of Mrs. Donovan and other women who had gathered, Nora successfully brought their daughter into the world. When Quinn was finally allowed into the room and saw Nora holding their baby, he wept openly. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and reached out one finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. She immediately grasped it, her grip surprisingly strong, and Quinn let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "She is perfect," he whispered. "You are both perfect. What should we name her?" Nora asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at their daughter's face, Quinn said, "Grace. I would like to name her Grace if that is acceptable to you." "Grace Harlow," Nora repeated. "It is beautiful. Yes, let us call her Grace." They stayed in Fort Lyon for another month, giving Nora time to recover and Grace time to grow stronger before the journey back to the mountains. During that time, Quinn proved to be a devoted father, never complaining about the sleepless nights or the constant demands of a newborn. He held Grace with surprising gentleness for such a large man, talking to her in a low voice about the mountains she would grow up in, the things he would teach her. Finally, in late July, they made the journey back to their cabin. It was slower with a baby, requiring more stops and more care, but they managed it successfully. When they arrived, Nora felt a profound sense of homecoming. The mountains welcomed them back with clear skies and warm sun, and the cabin, though it had stood empty for weeks, was exactly as they had left it. Life settled into a new rhythm, one that included Grace's needs alongside all their other responsibilities. Nora marveled at how quickly they adapted, how naturally Quinn took to fatherhood despite his long years alone. He built a cradle for Grace that rocked gently when nudged, and he carried her in a sling against his chest while doing chores so Nora could rest. As Grace grew from a baby to a toddler, the cabin filled with the sounds of her laughter and chatter. She was a mountain child through and through, fearless in exploring the world around her, delighted by the animals that came near the cabin. Quinn taught her to identify animal tracks, to listen to the forest, to respect the wilderness that was their home. Nora taught her songs and stories, the beginning of reading and numbers, the things that would give her a foundation for learning. 2 years after Grace's birth, Nora became pregnant again. This time they made no plans to go to Fort Lyon. Nora felt more confident about childbirth now, and they had learned enough to manage on their own if necessary. Still, Quinn insisted on riding to town 3 weeks before the baby was due to bring back Dr. Harrison. The doctor agreed to stay with them for as long as needed, curious about their isolated life and pleased to help. Their son was born in the cabin on a crisp autumn morning, arriving quickly and with less difficulty than Grace's birth. They named him Quentin after his father, though they called him Quincy to avoid confusion. He was a large baby with dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and from the beginning he had a calm temperament that contrasted with his sister's exuberance. Dr. Harrison stayed for a week, fascinated by the life Quinn and Nora had built. Before he left, he told them he had never seen a happier or more harmonious family. His words stayed with Nora long after he returned to Fort Lyon, a confirmation of what she already knew in her heart. She had found her place in the world, had built something beautiful and lasting with Quinn. The years passed with the rhythm of seasons in the high country. Springs of mud and rushing water, summers of warm sun and long days, autumns of brilliant color and preparation, winters of deep snow and cozy evenings by the fire. Quinn and Nora's family grew by one more. Another daughter they named Hope, completing their family of 5. The children thrived in the mountains, growing strong and confident and deeply connected to the land around them. Grace became an excellent tracker, able to read sign like her father. Quincy developed a fascination with plants and herbs, helping his mother tend her ever-expanding medicinal garden. Hope, the baby, was still finding her way but showed signs of inheriting her father's way with animals. Quinn built additions onto the cabin as the family grew, creating separate rooms for the children and expanding the living spaces. What had started as a simple single-room structure had become a substantial home, comfortable and well-suited to their needs. They still made trips to Fort Lyon, usually once or twice a year, to trade and buy supplies. But the children came to view town as a strange and somewhat overwhelming place. The mountains were their real home. Nora sometimes thought back to the young woman she had been, standing terrified in that saloon facing a debt she could never repay. She thought about Quinn walking into her life like some force of nature, paying what she owed and expecting nothing in return. She thought about how easily she could have let him walk away, could have accepted his gift and never seen him again. The choices they had made, the risks they had taken in pursuing this unlikely relationship, had led to a life richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined. Yes, it was hard sometimes. The isolation could be challenging, especially in the depths of winter. The work was constant and demanding. There were dangers that came with mountain living, from wild animals to sudden storms to illness or injury far from medical help. But there was also profound joy. The sight of Quinn teaching their children to fish in the creek. The sound of laughter echoing through the cabin on cold winter nights. The feeling of falling asleep each night wrapped in her husband's arms, secure in the knowledge that they had built something lasting and true. One evening, 15 years after their wedding, Nora and Quinn sat on the cabin porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. The children were inside, Grace helping the younger two with their lessons while Quinn and Nora took a rare moment alone. "Do you ever regret it?" Quinn asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Giving up town life for this?" Nora looked at him in surprise. "Never, not once. Do you?" "Not for a second." He took her hand, his thumb stroking over the silver ring he had made her all those years ago. It was worn now, the turquoise faded, but Nora had never taken it off. "I was half a man before you, just going through the motions of living. You made me whole again." "We made each other whole," Nora corrected. She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him that had never wavered in all their years together. "You saved me that day in the saloon, but you have been saving me every day since in ways large and small. You gave me a life I love, a family I adore, and purpose beyond what I ever hoped to find." "I love you, Nora Harlow," Quinn said, his voice carrying all the weight of emotion he usually kept buried deep. "I love you too, Quinn Harlow, more than words could ever express." They sat together as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. From inside the cabin came the muffled sounds of their children, the everyday noises of family life that had become so precious to them both. The mountains stood eternal around them, witness to their love and their commitment to building something that would outlast them both. In the distance, a wolf howled and Quinn instinctively tightened his arm around Nora's shoulders. But there was no real danger, just the wild calling to itself, a reminder that they lived in a place of beauty and power that demanded respect. It was exactly where they belonged, exactly where they had always meant to be. As they finally rose to go inside, Nora paused in the doorway and looked back at the mountains one more time. She thought of all the paths her life might have taken, all the different choices that could have been made, and she knew with absolute certainty that this, right here, was the best possible outcome. The debt her father had owed had been paid long ago, but the gift that payment had brought into her life was beyond price. She smiled and stepped inside, closing the door on the night and stepping into the warmth and light of home, where Quinn and their children waited. Where love lived in every corner and happiness was not just a distant hope but a daily reality. Years continued to pass in the high country, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Grace grew into a young woman of remarkable capability, eventually marrying a young man from Fort Lyon who proved willing to embrace mountain life. They built their own cabin a few miles from Quinn and Nora's place, close enough for regular visits but far enough to establish their own independence. Grace's husband was a good man, hardworking and respectful, and Quinn approved of the match even though it was difficult to see his eldest daughter begin her own life. Quincy showed no interest in settling down, preferring to spend his time exploring the mountains and studying the natural world around him. He talked of eventually going to Denver or even further east to study botany and medicine formally. And though the idea of him leaving pained Quinn and Nora, they supported his dreams. Hope, their youngest, remained at home, helping her mother and developing her own skills in crafts and healing. Quinn's hair had gone silver at the temples, and lines of age had deepened on his face, but he remained as strong and vital as ever. The mountain life kept him active and healthy, and he showed no signs of slowing down. Nora, too, had aged gracefully, her blonde hair showing threads of silver but her spirit as bright as ever. They had grown old together in the best possible way, their love deepening with each passing year rather than fading. They became known throughout the region as the couple who had defied expectations and built something remarkable. Trappers and traders who passed through the area would stop at their cabin, knowing they would be welcomed with food and conversation. Stories were told about Quinn Harlow and his wife, the woman who had left civilization to live in the mountains, who had raised strong children and created a home in the wilderness. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Quinn surprised Nora with a trip. They rode down from the mountains, leaving the cabin in Grace and her husband's capable hands, and traveled to Denver. It was the first time Nora had been to a real city since leaving Ohio decades earlier, and it was overwhelming in both good and bad ways. But Quinn had planned carefully, booking them a room in a nice hotel and taking her to theaters and restaurants she had only dreamed of. "Why did you do this?" Nora asked on their last evening in Denver as they sat in their hotel room. "You hate cities." "I do," Quinn admitted, "but you gave up so much for me, for our life in the mountains. I wanted to give you something back, to show you that I recognize what you sacrificed." Nora crossed to where he sat and took his face in her hands. "I sacrificed nothing. I gained everything. But thank you for this. It has been wonderful. Though I am ready to go home now." "Me too," Quinn said with relief, and they both laughed. The journey back to their cabin felt like returning to where they belonged. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Nora felt tension she had not realized she was carrying melt away. The city had been interesting, but it was not home. Home was the cabin they had built together, the land they knew intimately, the life they had created. More years passed, measured not by calendars but by seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Grace gave them 3 grandchildren, 2 boys and a girl, who would run wild through the mountains just as their mother had. Quincy eventually did leave for Denver to pursue his studies, though he returned every summer to spend time with his family and gather specimens for his research. Hope married a man from a neighboring homestead, someone who understood mountain life and shared her values. Quinn and Nora found themselves transitioning into the role of elders, the wise ones younger people came to for advice and guidance. They embraced this new phase of life, enjoying the relative peace that came with having raised their children and seeing them settled and happy. One autumn evening, 25 years after their wedding, they sat by the creek that ran near their cabin. It was the same spot where Quinn had proposed all those years ago, though they had added a proper bench since then to make sitting more comfortable. "We have had a good life," Quinn said, his arm around Nora's shoulders. "The best life," Nora agreed. "Sometimes I still cannot quite believe it all happened, that you walked into that saloon and changed everything." "I cannot imagine my life without you now," Quinn said. "Cannot even remember clearly what it was like before, and I do not want to. You are my whole world, Nora. You and our children and the life we built." "And you are mine," Nora replied. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his body against hers. "Every choice we made, every challenge we faced, it was all worth it to be here now together." The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The creek burbled its eternal song, and somewhere in the forest an owl called out, beginning its nightly hunt. The mountains stood around them, unchanging and eternal, having witnessed their love story from beginning to, someday, its inevitable end. But that end was not yet here. They still had time, precious years stretching ahead, filled with grandchildren to spoil and new challenges to face, and the simple joy of waking up each morning next to the person they loved most in the world. As full darkness fell, they walked back to their cabin hand in hand, their steps sure and confident on the familiar path. Smoke rose from the chimney and lamplight glowed in the windows. It was home, the truest and best home either of them had ever known. and as they stepped inside, closing the door against the cool autumn night, they knew with absolute certainty that they had found what so many people spend their entire lives searching for and never find. They had found each other. And that had made all the difference. The seasons continued their endless cycle, and Quinn and Nora moved through them with the ease of people who had truly mastered the art of living in harmony with nature and with each other. Winter snows came and melted away. Spring brought new life bursting forth. Summer warmed the high meadows. Autumn painted the aspen groves gold. Through it all they remained constant, their love the anchor that held them steady through whatever the years might bring. Their grandchildren grew, learning from Quinn and Nora the skills and values that had sustained their family through decades of mountain living. They learned to hunt and fish, to track and trap, to read the weather and respect the wild things. But they also learned kindness and integrity, the importance of keeping your word, the value of hard work and perseverance. Grace and her husband had taken over much of the heavy work around Quinn and Nora's cabin, recognizing that while their parents were still capable, they deserved to take things easier after so many years of hard labor. Quinn protested initially, not ready to admit that age was catching up with him, but Nora gently reminded him that accepting help was not weakness but wisdom. 30 years after their wedding, Quinn fell ill with a fever that left him weak for several weeks. It was the first time in their marriage that he had been truly vulnerable, unable to care for himself or contribute to the work that needed doing. Nora tended him with patient devotion, just as he had cared for her through 3 pregnancies and numerous minor illnesses over the years. She sat by his bedside, bathing his fevered skin, coaxing him to eat and drink, telling him stories to pass the long hours of recovery. When he finally regained his strength and was able to move about normally again, Quinn held Nora close and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." "Never," Nora replied fiercely. "We promised each other a lifetime, and I intend to hold you to that promise for as long as possible." Quinn laughed, the sound still strong despite his recent illness. "You are a stubborn woman, Nora Harlow." "I learned from the best," she retorted, and they both smiled, understanding the truth in the jest. Their stubbornness, their refusal to give up when things got difficult, had been one of the keys to their successful marriage. More years passed, and they continued to age together with grace and humor. Quinn's hair went completely silver, as did Nora's, and their faces bore the marks of decades spent in mountain sun and wind. But their eyes remained bright with love and intelligence, and their spirits remained young despite the aging of their bodies. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary surrounded by their entire family, children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren gathering at the cabin for a day of food and stories and celebration. Looking around at the faces of the family they had created, Quinn and Nora felt a profound sense of accomplishment. They had started with nothing but love and determination, and they had built something that would endure long after they were gone. "What is the secret?" Grace asked her parents that evening as the party was winding down. "How did you make it work for so long when so many marriages fail?" Quinn and Nora exchanged a look, that wordless communication that comes from decades of partnership. Then Nora said, "Respect, kindness. Choosing each other every single day, not just on the day we married but every day since. And recognizing that love is not just a feeling," Quinn added. "It is action. It is work. It is showing up for each other when things are hard, not just when they are easy." "We were also lucky," Nora continued. "Lucky to find each other. Lucky to have the courage to take a chance on something unconventional. Lucky to have good health and strong children and a life that suited us both. But we made our own luck too," Quinn said, "by being willing to adapt, to compromise, to build something together rather than insisting on having things our own way." Their children and grandchildren absorbed these words, understanding that they were receiving something precious, the distilled wisdom of a successful marriage spanning 4 decades. As the family gradually departed over the next few days, returning to their own homes and lives, Quinn and Nora found themselves alone again. The cabin felt larger with everyone gone, but also more peaceful. They settled back into their routines, comfortable with each other's presence, and with the silence that came from having said everything that needed to be said. One spring morning, 42 years after their wedding, Nora woke to find Quinn sitting on the porch watching the sunrise. She joined him, bringing coffee that she had learned to make exactly the way he preferred it over their long years together. "Thank you," Quinn said, accepting the cup. His hands were gnarled now with arthritis, his movements slower, but his grip was still sure. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun rose higher, painting the mountains in shades of pink and gold. Birds began their morning songs, and somewhere nearby, a deer moved through the undergrowth, unafraid of the human presence it had come to recognize as harmless. "Do you ever think about that day in the saloon?" Nora asked softly. "When you paid my father's debt, sometimes," Quinn admitted. "I think about how close I came to not doing it, to just staying out of your troubles and moving on with my solitary life. What would have happened if I had made that choice, if I had not spoken up? You would have lived your life alone in the mountains, Nora said, and I would have found some way to survive, though I cannot imagine what that would have looked like. We would have both been poorer for it, Quinn said. Not just in material ways, but in all the ways that truly matter. I would have missed knowing you, loving you, building this life with you. I would have missed our children and grandchildren. I would have missed everything that made life worth living. So why did you do it? Nora asked, a question she had asked before, but whose answer she never tired of hearing. What made you speak up that day? Quinn was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. Finally he said, I saw you standing there so young and scared, but also so determined not to show it. And I remembered what it felt like to be alone and desperate with no hope of help. I remembered your father's kindness to me, but it was more than that. It was you. Even in that brief moment, I saw something in you that called to something in me. A connection I did not understand but could not ignore. Fate, Nora suggested. Maybe, Quinn agreed. Or maybe just luck. But whatever it was, I am grateful for it every single day. They sat together as the morning unfolded around them, two people who had defied the odds and built something beautiful from the most unlikely of beginnings. The debt that had brought them together was long forgotten by everyone except them, and they remembered it not as a burden, but as the beginning of their greatest adventure. As they rose to begin their daily tasks, moving with the careful deliberation of those whose bodies no longer obeyed quite as quickly as their minds, they did so with the quiet contentment of people who had lived well and loved deeply. Whatever time remained to them, whether years or merely days, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else. The mountains stood eternal around them, having witnessed countless love stories over the millennia, some ending in tragedy, others in triumph. But few, the mountains might have said if they could speak, burned as bright or lasted as long as the love between Quinn Harlow and Nora Pruitt, the mountain man who paid a debt expecting nothing, and the woman who gave him everything in return. Their story was not grand by the world's standards. No historians would record it. No monuments would commemorate it. But it was a story of significance nonetheless, proof that love can bloom in the most unlikely places, that kindness can change the course of lives, that two people willing to work hard and compromise and choose each other every day can build something that endures. And so their days continued in the high country of Colorado, measured not in dramatic events but in small moments of joy and connection. The touch of hands across a dinner table, the shared laughter over some private joke no one else would understand, the comfort of familiar presence on a cold night, the knowledge that whatever came, they would face it together. This was the true happily ever after, not some fairy tale ending where everything became perfect, but a real and lasting partnership between two flawed people who loved each other enough to work through the imperfections. It was beautiful not because it was easy, but because it was real, earned through years of effort and devotion. And when their time finally came to leave this world, as it must for all living things, they would do so knowing they had lived fully, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy that would continue in their children and grandchildren. The cabin they had built would stand for generations, a testament to what they had created together. The lessons they had taught would be passed down, keeping their values alive long after their voices had fallen silent, but that ending was not yet. For now, they had this day, and the next after that. They had morning coffee on the porch and evening walks by the creek. They had visits from family and the changing of seasons. They had each other, and that, they both knew with absolute certainty, was enough, more than enough. It was everything that truly mattered, everything they had ever needed. The debt had been paid with $300, but the return on that investment was beyond any measure of wealth the world recognized. Quinn Harlow had paid Nora Pruitt's debt and told her she owed nothing. But in truth, they had both been saved that day, both been given a second chance at happiness they had thought lost forever, and they had seized that chance with both hands, building a life that honored the gift they had been given. Their love story was not complicated, but it was complete. And as they lived out their final years in the mountains they both loved, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built, they knew they had found something rare and precious. They had found home. They had found purpose. They had found each other. And they had found that sometimes the best things in life begin with a simple act of kindness, a moment of courage, and the willingness to take a chance on something that seems impossible. $300 had bought more than freedom from debt. It had bought a lifetime of love, a family, a legacy. It had bought everything that mattered. And neither Quinn nor Nora would have changed a single moment of the journey that money had set in motion.